All right, we were reviewing or talking a little bit about scripture passages in the New Testament that prove that there's going to be false teachers and false doctrine coming into the churches, and that Paul and other men of God, Paul and other apostles, said that it was going to happen. And they gave us even some examples of it taking place. Diotrephes, probably a pastor, at least a leader in a church, very much had the idea that the pastor could stomp on the people, that he was the ruler and everybody else was subject to him. And we kind of see him as one of the first examples in the New Testament already of a pastor not having a proper view of authority. Not as how does the Bible put it, that the elder is not supposed to be someone who's stomping around thumping his chest, but he's supposed to be a loving shepherd of the sheep. I'm missing the word. It's in 1st or 2nd Peter. But anyway, but that's the proper view of being a pastor and how a church is supposed to be led of God. So Diotrephes is one example. In the book of Revelation, chapters 2 and 3, we saw several churches there that had already by that time left their first love. They had already been declared as dead. You think you're rich, and you're actually poor and miserable and blind and naked, and he even calls them dead at one point. There were already doctrinal issues that had entered into the churches, early churches, and John has to deal with those doctrinal issues. So it's important to understand that the early church was going to face false teachings, false doctrines, and so will we today, and that's always been the case. We have to stand for the truth. All right, I'm going to give you a section now that I want to give you a little bit of a direction as far as understanding history. Anytime you read history, anytime you read church history, there's some questions that you have to ask, and I kind of challenged you this way the other day in our last class period. Anytime you read, you ought to ask questions. You ought to be discerning. Anybody who just reads it and takes it in and says, hey, this is written down, this is in a book, so it must be true, that's not wise at all. Definitely not on the internet, right? That's the joke, that it must be true. I read it on the internet. No, don't read that way. Read discerning. Read asking questions. There's a big difference, I think, between challenging a pastor. Let's say, like the Bereans, they read their Bibles and they verified what Paul said to make sure that it was true. There's a big difference between that and openly, brazenly challenging the pastor on every issue. Okay? Certainly your dad wouldn't want his members constantly, I don't think the Bible, on the way out Sunday morning, shaking his hand, I don't think the Bible means that because I think it means, we don't need that. But he would be very happy if all of his church members, I would think, studied their Bible and said, hey, okay, he said it's true. I want to check and see, make sure that it's true. You got to read that way. When you read history, and especially in church history. So let me give you some questions to ask when you're studying and reading history. Number one, and this is especially true in church history. Number one, who is in charge? Who is in charge? You ought to ask yourself that question when you start to read church history. Who is in charge? That question will tell you, when you answer it, it'll tell you who's writing the history, right? It'll tell you who's writing history. A lot of the history that we have written about church history, if you ask yourself who's in charge, it's the Catholic Church. So a lot of that history is obviously going to be very slanted, and it's going to say what they want it to say. I have some examples with me. I'll show you in a little bit on my computer of, and you can do this in any Catholic encyclopedia. It took me about 5 minutes to get these 2 examples. And they're perfect examples. Whoever's in charge is going to write their own history, right? Isn't that what the Egyptians did? There's very little reference to the children of Israel leaving the land of Egypt with all those plagues. Why? Because they wrote their own history. And they didn't like telling their own history when it was negative about themselves. It's all about their own destruction and their gods being defeated. So naturally, they didn't include that as their history. They would literally, of course, back then they didn't have books like we do and computer chips and memory storage and so on. So they would literally put it on these rock steels or whatever they call those, however you pronounce that. They would put it on stone and engrave it in stone. Well, a later leader came along and said, I don't like that history, and they would literally deface the stone to get rid of history because they didn't want it reflecting negatively upon themselves. Well, the Catholic Church was in charge of most of the church age, as we call it, and so they didn't include things that were negative to them. So you ought to ask yourself, who is in charge? Let me give you another question to ask. What did they want to change or keep the same? What did they want to change or keep the same? If you study the Catholic Church at all, which we will, of course, you'll see that there's constantly things changing. In the early days, they baptized differently. In the early days of the Catholic Church, they had lots of different doctrines that developed over the years. Literally some over hundreds and over 1,000 years. They haven't always baptized infants. They haven't always baptized by sprinkling. So what did they want to change or keep the same? If you read early Catholic history, it's different than later Catholic history. What did they want to change or keep the same? Some other questions. What did the authorities use to justify their actions? What did the authorities use to justify their actions? Boy, as I think on this, I'm constantly thinking on Catholic writings of how they attacked their enemies and accused them of, all kinds of things. What did the authorities use to justify their actions? All right, let's think, for example, I can't fathom the persecution of the Inquisition, not just persecution against Christians, but everybody was in danger. Catholics were in danger. In fact, much of the Inquisition was aimed at Catholics. The Catholic Church persecuting anybody who was rich because they were flat stealing their land and their property and so on. If you in any way, a lot of times the persecution wasn't even aimed at those who challenged the church. So if you challenge the church, you're gonna get a midnight knock on the door. If you were rich, you probably were gonna get a midnight knock on the door unless you had a connection with some higher up. So I can't even fathom the types of things that they did to those people. So how do they justify that? How does the Catholic Church justify that? Well, they accuse them of heresies. These poor women, who, they're already sickly and so on. And they accuse them of heresy, and they accuse them of, not baptizing their infant or whatever, some cooked up charges. And that warrants having this unbelievable torture until, even if you weren't guilty, they'd torture you until you admitted your guilt. Now you deserve it. So, we found out the truth. Yeah, You tortured the truth, the admission of a lie out of them. What did they use to justify their actions? Lies, heresy. You look even at any history. These are good questions to ask. Adolf Hitler, what did he use to justify those actions? Most Germans, anybody German in here? Most Germans of that day believed what he was. They didn't know about all the torture. I don't think that. I don't believe that personally, but they did believe in his quest to make the German people the number one people in the world, and the Aryan race was going to be number one in the world. And the people believed that. So there was, anyway, when you read, you have to ask yourself this question: what are they trying to get at? History is not neutral, is it? I know, I ask sometimes kids on my route or something like that, people that obviously aren't into education. That's a nice way to say something mean, right? They're dumb. No. But I ask them, what do you think of history? Oh, I hate history. It's just a bunch of numbers and dates. Oh, no, it's not. History is full of this happened because of this, and this happened because of this. And having a proper understanding of why things happened is so important. So you have to ask yourselves these questions. Why do they believe why do they practice? What did the authorities use to justify their actions? Fourth, another good question to ask. Why were the authorities convincing? Why were the authorities convincing? Well, in the Catholic Church, they were convincing because these are the men of God. They were convincing because they had the power. They had control of the nation or whatever. Why would kings submit themselves to the Pope? Okay, well, there's more to it than just religion. The Pope was not just this awesome religious figure. The Pope had his own armies. The Pope had his own loyal subjects, and they literally went to war with each other. So the Pope was the authority, the ultimate authority. Great question to ask yourself. Fifth, one more. Why were the authorities not convincing to others? Why were authorities not convincing to others? All right, who was not in submission to the Catholic Church? All these groups that I mentioned earlier. The Waldenses were chased all over Europe. Big towns obliterated at different times. There's massacres of tens of thousands of people who did not submit themselves to the authority of the Catholic Church. Why? Why would they take a stand against this awesome, powerful figurehead of a Catholic Church and the government? Well, it's because they believed something, right? It's because they had their set of beliefs. And it's amazing to me how powerful a set of beliefs is. Did I say that right? Yes. How powerful it is. It's bad English, actually, because I ended with a... was that a verb? It's amazing. Our set of beliefs guides us in our lives. Our set of beliefs has taken millions of people to their deaths. Think about that. So, why were the authorities not convincing? Almost always, usually anyway, it's because of their beliefs. It wasn't always. Sometimes the authorities were not convincing, for example, to Henry VIII. because he wanted to do his own thing. But still, there are times where the authorities were not convincing. So these are some questions to ask yourselves as you study church history, and as you study any history for that matter. All right, now let me give you a great example, I think. I took a screenshot of a couple things. So, going back to the first question, who is in charge? That to me is one of the most pivotal. Who's writing the history? Now, what are true Bible believers doing during most of the Middle Age? Are they living their lives in privacy? They're trying to, certainly. But are they living their lives in privacy? Are they left alone? Are they sitting at home in a life of ease, writing, and putting out all these theology books? No, they're not. What are they doing? They're running for their lives. They're hiding from the authorities. They're in the mountains of Switzerland and the Alps, hiding. And so, who's writing the history? The Catholics. They're sitting in their palaces. They're sitting in their life of ease, speaking all the these and the thous. So listen to what, and this is amazing. If you look at any Catholic history book, any Catholic encyclopedia, I showed you those in the library, they have an unbelievably slanted view of history. Let's see here. Here's one, for example. As for Bernard of Luxembourg, another Dominican friar, he displays skills for classification which verge on the obsessional when, in his book, I can't even read it, issued in 1522, he managed to quote a total of 432 categories of present or former heresies. He found 432 categories of heresy. What a great man, right? I mean, he's going around identifying hundreds of different kinds of false doctrines. Now, say, well, that's great, right? To which he conscientiously added 26 unclassified heresies. It becomes clear that the professional investigations undertaken by the courts of faith were confronted by a complex web of unorthodoxy. Okay, now, let me just simplify that. What it's saying is, this guy had an unbelievable skill in identifying heresies so that he could keep those heresies out of the church. 432, he came up with 26 unclassified heresies. He was confronted, the courts of faith, that's the Catholic Church, were confronted by a complex web of unorthodoxy. Wow. What it's saying is this guy could find anything wrong anywhere in the world. And, of course, who are the heretics? Who brings out these so-called heresies? Anybody who disagrees with them. So there's heretics everywhere. And the heretics are the Waldensians. The heretics are those who believe that you rebaptize people, like the Anabaptists. And this guy was so spiritual that he found them all. He could figure out what they were teaching. And the interesting thing also about this is that anytime somebody was accused of anything in the court of the Catholic Church, they were accused of being a heretic in some area. And they had fancy names for him. And this guy had 432 special, specific names for these different false teachings and doctrines. Okay, so they make it sound good. And in reality, you have to ask yourself the question, who's in charge? He's doing these things because he can. And he can recognize all these Bible believers and identify them as heretics. Give you another example. Here's I forget the name of the book. I don't have it here. But, well, It's looking funny on me. About 1400 AD, heresy caused by the Waldensians, okay? Heresy caused by the Waldensians. Now, in order to be honest, we would want to look at the Waldensians themselves, which I have, and you hopefully will too, and see what they actually believed. You know, it's one thing, it's like in our media today. You know, they just present it and say, this is what happened. Well, then you get to looking at it and you say, okay, that's actually not at all what happened. Heresy caused by the Waldensians developed in the province. Peter the Celestine came to Stettin to investigate the matter and scattered the heretics in 1393. Now, that's what the Catholics' history book here says about that. Peter the Celestine came to Stettin to investigate the matter and scattered the heretics. Now, you want to know what actually happened there? He brought some soldiers, not Bible believers. He brought some soldiers to this town, and he attacked men, women, and children, killed a bunch of people, massacred a bunch of people, and scattered them that way. All this book says is he came to investigate this heretical matter and scatter the heretics. You better ask yourself who's in charge. You know, look, I'm all for getting rid of heresy, right? Unless the heresy is believing in salvation by grace through faith. The heresy is whatever the writer identifies as heresy. Peter the Celestine, he was a massacre man. And yet here in the Catholic book, he's a hero. You'll see this all through Catholic history. So be careful what you read. Better ask yourself some questions. Any questions on that section? I'll be asking you for those 5 questions, and there's many more you could ask, but those are 5 good questions to ask yourself. Okay, this next section that I want to give you has a list of 7 things, 7 lessons from Baptist history. This is actually taken from an essay, and it's part of your book here. Let's see here. On page 11. So if you'd like, you can put them into your notes, or you can just, you have them already on page 11 of your textbook. This is a section called Lessons Learned from Baptist History by Dr. Richard Weeks. Richard Weeks is already passed away, but he was a church history and Baptist history teacher at Maranatha Baptist Bible College when they first opened. A few years before, about 10 years before this college was opened, Dr. Myron Cederholm opened Maranatha Baptist College and produced hundreds of preachers. Okay, and a lot of those are still around. We have some of our some of our staff, older staff, who went to Maranatha Baptist. When this college was first opened, they were very much a college like us. They are not anymore. They've definitely gone a different direction. But Richard Weeks was a real professor of Baptist and church history. And he identifies 7 lessons from Baptist history. So let me give you these 7, and they're in your book as I mentioned as well. But number 1, there's been a heritage of New Testament believers and New Testament churches through all centuries. There's no doubt about that. That's Bible, Matthew chapter 16. The gates of hell shall not prevail against it. And the Roman Catholic Church throughout history has termed New Testament believers as heretics. But that doesn't change the fact there's always been some group that has held true to the faith. You say, well, man, it sure looks like in the Middle Ages everything was dark and everything was bleak, and there weren't any Christians living in the time where the Roman Catholic Church was so powerful. Really? Well, who did they kill? I know it was a lot of their own and a lot of rich landowners and so on, but it was also Bible believers. How many of you have looked through or read some of, if not all of, Fox's Book of Martyrs? Okay, at least looked at it. I hope you do sometime. It's just an eye-opening book. When I read there, I can't read too much because it's so awful. What is that? That's people mostly, it's not all, but it's mostly people who were true believers and stayed away from the Catholic Church, did not believe in this idea of the sacral society, of the state running the church, absolutely abhorred that idea. And those kind of Christians have always been around. Is there an ordained line of churches, Baptist churches, all the way back to the apostles? No. But because of believing the gospel, believing the doctrines of the New Testament, that definitely puts us in the same category as those great believers of the past. There's been a heritage of New Testament believers through all the centuries. There's a guy, J.M. Carroll, who is an expert on church history. He estimates that about 50 million New Testament believers were executed through the Middle Ages by the Catholics and the Reformers, the Catholics and the Protestants. 50 million. Number two, there has been a price that New Testament Christians have had to pay in order to remain true. There has been a price that New Testament Christians have had to pay in order to remain true. Have you paid much of a price? In comparison to them, I haven't. My parents did some. You know, my parents took a stand and left the Amish faith and were saved. And they lost most all of their family, brothers and sisters. There was 15 children in my dad's family and 15 children in my mom's side of the family. And almost all of them completely cut ties with them. So there's a price that they had to pay, but you know, they would demean us and talk and gossip and make up rumors about us and so on. But they never hit anybody. You know, they never came by and burned our barn to the ground or anything like. They didn't do any of those kinds of things. So even in that sense, we never really suffered persecution. But there's a price to pay if you're going to be a Christian. There is a price to pay. You know, even the apostles who were beaten for their faith, they were happy to pay that price. They were happy to pay it. They said, we're rejoicing that we're kind of worthy to suffer for his name, Acts chapter 4 and 5. So don't be afraid of that. Don't be, our belief system, as I mentioned earlier, our belief system is worth living for and it's worth dying for. And sometimes I think about that with my family. You know, I have little children. Do I really, I want to live. I love living. But if it came down to it, there are things that are more important than living. If I was presented with the opportunity to turn on my beliefs and to turn on the Bible, and my children saw me turn on the Bible and continue to live, that would be more harmful to them than if their father was taken away from them. Think about that. So, there's a price to pay. New Testament Christians have always paid that price. Whether it's something small on the level of being just verbally attacked or whether you're physically attacked. Third, church history was written primarily by those who hated New Testament Christianity. So true. Church history was written primarily by those who hated New Testament Christianity. Yeah, those heretics. We went and we scattered the heretics. Yeah, we got rid of them. Oh, how'd you do that? well, we killed those expecting children, took babies and murdered them brutally. That's how you scattered the heretics. It's not some noble act. Anyway, there's so much of church history that is skewed history. The Crusades. Oh yeah, the Crusades. That was the Catholic Church. According to the Catholic Church, they were going to liberate the Holy Land from the Muslims. And if you read most history, that is how the Crusades are defined. The Catholic Church, the Christians, fighting against the Muslims to liberate the Holy Land. It couldn't be further from the truth. The Christians, the Catholic Church, was going to take over the Holy Land, and they killed a bunch of the Jews who lived there, and on and on. They were stealing the Holy Land for themselves, is what was actually happening. But it was written by those who hated New Testament. History is written by those who hated New Testament Christianity. The doctrine of baptism was the issue, one of the big issues of hatred by Catholics and Reformers against Baptists. Didn't that sound ridiculous? You baptize different than me, so I'm going to kill you. I'm going to persecute you. I'm going to run your families out of their homes and burn the homes to the ground because we disagree on baptism. New Testament Christians didn't have the time or the resources to write their history. By the way, some few did write history. And in the last, probably I would say about 100 years or so, a lot of information has started to pop up. Books have been found detailing the history of the Waldensians and the history of some of these other groups. And it's been published. And now there's a real light being shined on true New Testament believers. And the one guy, American in Crimson Red, James Beller, I'm reading a book by him right now. I think I mentioned this about St. Louis. Well, that's the kind of history we're talking about. There are some true Bible believers who did write some of their history, and it's starting, more and more is being found, has been found, and is being published. Church history is written by those who hate New Testament Christianity. Fourth, church history should arm us against future persecution. Church history should arm us, should warn us, should prepare us against future persecution. It challenges me, right? When I read Fox's Book of Martyrs, I'm ashamed at how little I've had to suffer, how little I've had to give for the Lord. Man, we live in our nice houses and have all our nice things, and nobody hurts us. We go soul winning last night. Nobody bothers us really. Not much. I heard a couple stories. Get out, off this street, But then, even then, that's not persecution. But church history should arm us against future persecution. Number 5. The prophecy of Scripture as to the endurance of the church has been true through all the centuries. The prophecy of Scripture as to the endurance of the church has been true through all the centuries. The gates of hell shall not prevail against the church. The gates of hell. The hell cannot stop the church. Will not stop the church. By the way, that phrase is a very interesting phrase, Can you picture tall gates? And I can't build a proper gate here. And we've got these strong gates and everything's blocked off. What is a gate for? A gate is for defense. A gate is to protect yourself. You don't pick up a gate unless you're Samson. You don't pick up a gate and go swinging a gate around on offense. Right? A gate is set. A gate blocks the way. Hell is the gate. Hell is not on the attack. Hell is the gate that the church is supposed to be on the offense. The church is supposed to be attacking the gates of hell, and they cannot stop the church. So wherever the gates are set up by the Catholics and by all of by the devil, wherever those gates are set up to stop the church has always gone through those gates. In every century, the church has gone through those gates. So, the Catholics say, yeah, man, we scattered those Waldenses. Yeah, for now. But somewhere else, there were other Waldenses and other groups at the very same time that these guys were being martyred for the cause of Christ. There were other groups who were attacking the gates of hell and defeated those gates and went through those gates. So in every century, the endurance of the church has been there. They've continued on and been on the attack. By the way, we are on the attack. We're not supposed to sit on our laurels and do nothing in the church. We're supposed to be soul winning. The best number one method of attack is soul winning. It was a year or two ago, we had a guy preaching here, and he had a great take on this. Caleb, you might remember this, some of you others who've been here a while. But he said, whenever I see someone fall by the wayside and go off into sin, somebody who was faithful, I think, well, the devil got them. Now I'm going to go get somebody else and steal them from the devil. Go soul winning. Go on the offense. Win somebody else. Teach them. And he stole one from us. We're going to steal one from him. We're on the offense. And the church should always be that way. Number 6. Christians need to be acquainted with true New Testament church history. Not the Catholic version of it. Not the false, biased version of it. Christians need to be acquainted with true New Testament church history. Part of that, huge part of that, is that we're not Protestant. We didn't come out of the Catholic Church. We've never been a part of the Catholic Church. The true New Testament church has always resisted false doctrine. Baptists, and I should say even more than that, true believers were never part of the Catholic Church. They were never Protestant. They didn't align themselves with denominations like that. True New Testament believers have always been independent. Number 7, and this is an interesting point that he makes here, Baptists are primarily responsible for the blessings of religious liberty in America. This is so true. The more I study about this, the more I read about Baptists in America, true Bible believers have always pushed for true liberty. And the fact that we have had for 200 years in our country, and I think it has definitely been partially true as well in Canada and so on, the reason is because of true Bible believers understanding that the state and the church don't fit together, and therefore leave the church alone. There's no question that the First Amendment, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. This whole thing now in America, all the talk is about the separation of church and state. That there's supposed to be this big wall of separation, so you can't have the church in the government. That's not even what that means. The whole interpretation of the First Amendment has always been, until recently, that the government couldn't get into the church's business, not vice versa. I mean, that's why there's prayers all over the Supreme Court walls. There's, in the House of Representatives, the Rotunda main area. The center lawgiver has all these murals of different lawgivers. The number one lawgiver right in the center is Moses. Obviously, the book of the law, the Bible. I mean, they pray before they open sessions of Congress and on and on. I mean, to say that we don't have the Christian influence in government, that the Founding Fathers didn't intend, that is obviously not even close to true. The point I'm making is that the freedom that we experience in America, and I'm assuming a lot of in Canada as well, used to especially, that was a product of Bible believers who had the right view of the church. Understand that the church is not involved in the civil affairs as far as running civil affairs. The church is supposed to be reaching people for the Lord and with the gospel and so on. Roger Williams established Rhode Island. He's known as probably known, I think, as the first Baptist, started the first Baptist church in America. He established Rhode Island as a colony for religious freedom because he had to flee from Boston. Who ran Boston? The Anglican Church. And they were persecuting Baptists. John Leland helped ensure that the freedom of religion was put into the Constitution, talking to James Madison and getting that in there. So, Baptists, they believe in freedom of religion. And true Bible believers have always felt that way. Okay, so that's an essay from Richard Weeks. Some very good observations to make there.